Up next is Joshua Bolten, the president and CEO of the Business Roundtable. Mr. Bolten brings over 20 years of government experience to the Business Roundtable, and among many initiatives he leads as the head of the BRT. Josh advocates for corporations to embrace sustainability and support sound climate policy. Josh, thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Bob. Glad to be here.
Josh, as I mentioned, you have a lot of experience in government. A very stressful job that you had, of course, was White House Chief of Staff. I got to ask you, have you given any advice to Ron Klain, the now Chief of Staff? But regardless, what would you advise him, since you've lived through that job?
Get plenty of rest and exercise.
Right.
All good advice, none of which he has time to take.
Very good. Okay, well, let's go to sustainability and how are business CEOs incorporating sustainability into their business models? As I mentioned, I was talking to Heather Zeichel, and the business community has moved. BRT has moved, and we'll talk about that. But what are you urging your members to do, and what are they doing?
Well, even without our urging, I think virtually all of them are trying to do their part to reduce their carbon footprints and transition to cleaner energy. Bob, we've got now over 220 CEOs in our organization, all CEOs of large companies. Collectively, they employ 20 million people. So these are big operations, and every one of them is taking some kind of step to contribute to reducing greenhouse gases in our environment, and also collectively here at the Business Roundtable, they're advocating for policies that they think will be effective in achieving what we need to do in getting to dramatic reductions in carbon in our atmosphere over the next 30 years.
Last year, the BRT announced a new position on climate. Can you describe it and how you rallied everyone to kind of get behind it? Because I know you gotta in any association, you gotta kind of herd the cats.
Yeah, and there are a lot of cats running around on climate issues, but we did get consensus behind a very clear direction on climate policy for the United States. This isn't a totally new thing for the Business Roundtable. Didn't come out of nowhere. Over a decade ago, we called for collective action to address man-made climate change. And in that time, companies have been each doing their own thing in reducing their carbon footprints and transitioning to cleaner energy individually. But then collectively, on behalf of the whole group, we came around to a statement last year, a statement of policy that endorsed the objectives of the Paris Agreement. We supported a goal consistent with the Paris Agreement of reducing net U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by at least 80% by 2050. We endorsed the objective of limiting global temperature rise this century to well below 2 degrees Celsius. And importantly, what the group consensus came around to was that the United States needs a national policy that creates a well-designed market-based mechanism that includes a price on carbon. And I think that last element is what's really important about the Business Roundtable statement, is that the major CEOs here in the United States, the large group of major CEOs represented at Business Roundtable, came to a consensus that we need to put a price on carbon, and that can only be done by legislated national policy.
And what do you think the prospects are for that type of legislation?
They're candidly not particularly good in the short term, and by short term I mean over the course of the next year or two. But I think the politics on this are moving pretty rapidly. I share the optimism that Heather Zeichel was bringing to the conversation you just had with her, that increasingly across the political spectrum, you will find recognition of the challenge that the United States and the rest of the countries of the planet face in getting global warming under control, in getting to as close as we can to net zero over the course of the coming decades, and the kinds of policies that are going to be needed to get us there. And the challenge has always been that that's hard to do without causing damage to some sector of the economy. But increasingly, evidence is emerging that there are constructive ways to do that that might even be good for the economy. I mean, it's easy to exaggerate all the benefits from going greener in energy, but there are a lot of benefits there. And with a well-designed portfolio of policies that end up putting a price on carbon, I'm confident that we ultimately can get to political consensus on policies that will, at the same time, get where we need to be on carbon emissions and not do damage to the U.S. economy.
You're a veteran of politics, and you mentioned kind of the movement. You know, some in the Republican Party, including a former president, has called climate change a hoax. Do you see that more and more Republicans are accepting what most scientists will say is that's not the case, and this is a problem that has to be addressed in one way or the other?
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think the hoax view is increasingly a fringe view, and it's certainly a fringe view in the business community, where U.S. business leaders have accepted for years that climate change is real, that there is a very substantial man-made contribution to climate change, and that there are policies and practices we need to pursue to address it. And I think increasingly that's going to become a mainstream view. I mean, I think there will always be fringe people who will say hoax. I think Bob, the important part of the politics here, though, is in persuading people that we can address the problem in a sensible way that does not wreck the economy in the meantime.
As you know, Josh, the big game in town is the infrastructure bill. President Biden looks like it's going to be done in two parts, where you're going to have infrastructure, and then you have the pay-fors. My read on it is the infrastructure is the easier part, though it's not easy. The tax component, raising corporate taxes and other taxes, is the hard part. What do you think of this package? I would imagine that you have kind of mixed views on it.
Yeah, we've got very mixed views on it. To the extent that the package includes real infrastructure, that is the network that connects goods and people in ways that improve the productive capacity of the economy. To the extent that it includes real infrastructure, and there's a lot in there, the business leaders that I represent strongly support that. And strongly support it because it really substantially improves the productive capacity of our country, very badly needed for us to stay competitive in the modern world. At the same time, on the Biden package, on the other hand, if it's paired with a huge corporate tax increase, which is the proposal that the Biden administration has put out, it cuts in completely the opposite direction by undermining the competitiveness of our economy. So we'd like to see substantial portions of the Biden proposal go forward on infrastructure, but without attempting to pay for it by a job-killing increase in corporate taxation here in the United States.
Josh, I had an interview with Richard Trumka, and of course their top priority is the ProAct, which is in the Biden package. I would imagine you don't think that's needed, especially you don't call it infrastructure.
Yeah, well, it's not infrastructure, and no, we don't feel it's needed. Most of our members have very good relations with the labor community. Those that are unionized and non-unionized, and so we don't think that sticking that kind of thing into an infrastructure package is constructive. Regardless of how you feel about stuff like the ProAct, there's an opportunity here for the Biden administration to and for Democrats and Republicans on the Hill to achieve a big bipartisan win. But what that means is they've got to stick to the components that are real infrastructure on which members of both parties agree, and they have to do it without a damaging tax increase.
I mean, do you think, I know it's an inside baseball kind of question, but do you think that the ProAct could even survive a reconciliation process, basically that's not conducive to the reconciliation rules, and the Senate parliamentarian would be asked perhaps by Republicans to rule against it? Because I do imagine it will be in the House bill, at least the initial bill.
Yeah, and far be it from me to usurp the place of one of the now very powerful figures in Washington, the parliamentarian of the Senate. But based on my own experience, the legislative activities rather than spending activities very commonly fall afoul of the Byrd rule in reconciliation, which means that it's very likely to be stripped from any legislation that the Democratic, I was going to say majority in the Senate, but I guess it's a majority, that the Democratic majority in the Senate tries to put forward. But here's what we'd really like to see is don't do it on a partisan basis. It doesn't have to be done through reconciliation, where you'll end up with a 50-50 vote, as we did on the COVID rescue package a few months ago. Do it on a bipartisan basis. Do real legislation. And one of the things about going regular order and passing real bipartisan legislation is that they can put in place the legislative policies that will make the spending that's in the bill much more effective. And that includes permitting reforms, and also includes a lot of things that will make it easier for the investments that are made in addressing the climate problem more effective, because you can actually do legislation. You don't just have to say this pot of money goes over here.
Josh, there's one way of paying for it, some in the union and business community, and actually it has bipartisan support on the Hill, at least some, is the implementation of a gas and or mileage tax. President Biden does not support this at this time. It could violate, certainly I think would violate his pledge not to raise taxes on it. Does BRT support a gas tax?
We do. We support user fees to pay for infrastructure. You know, that's Bob. That's the way it's traditionally been done most of the time in this country, and all of the time in many other countries, is that the users of particular pieces of infrastructure pay a fee assessed in different forms. They pay a fee to make use of that infrastructure, and that's economically efficient. It puts the cost on the right payers, and it's a sustainable thing. So you don't have to go through 10 or 20 or 30 years of neglect of your infrastructure and then have to jam through a big bill in Congress with a lot of spending. If you fund your infrastructure through user fees, you've created a way to keep the funding going as it's needed well into the future. And that's how countries that are that exceed us in the competitiveness of their infrastructure do it. It's certainly the way we ought to do it. So yes, we need to modify the gas tax we have at a minimum to take account of the fact that we're increasingly going to have vehicles on our roads that use electricity, not gas, which is a very good thing for our environment and for addressing the climate challenge. Those things need to be modified, but the business community is strongly behind fair user fees to fund infrastructure, and it's certainly a much better way to go than trying to tax the job creators in this country to fund the infrastructure that everybody uses.
Yep. No, it's going to be an interesting spring and summer and perhaps into the fall with this big bill. Josh Bolten, thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.